The Woodstock Railway was a 13.88-mile spur line that ran from White River Junction to Woodstock, Vermont. Although it was short, this rail line ultimately had an important impact on shaping Woodstock's destiny. The story of the Woodstock Railway actually began long before the railroad ever made its first run. As early as the 1840s, railroad fever was rampant in America. In Woodstock, the interest in railways exploded in 1847 when a map was published that showed a proposed railway line that started in Portland, Maine, and ran through Vermont to the Great Lakes region. One of the stops in Vermont for this projected line was Woodstock. There are a number of reasons why Woodstock was likely chosen to be a stop on the railway. First, in the mid-19th century, Woodstock was a prominent and prosperous town. In fact, it was the fifth largest town in Vermont in the 1840s. As you can see from this early photograph of Woodstock Central Street, it had a robust commercial district with many stores. Woodstock also was a shire town of Windsor County and therefore had the county courthouse, which meant that people who needed to conduct court business had to come to Woodstock. Woodstock had several hotels and inns, including this one called Church's Hotel, that was situated on the present-day Woodstock Inn's parking lot. It also had a number of mills, the largest of which was the Solomon Woodward Woolen Mill, shown here. In addition, Woodstock boasted a fair number of influential people who were excited about the project. Although the line running from Portland, Maine through Woodstock, Vermont to the Great Lakes was never implemented, interest in a railway that went to Woodstock continued, and on October 30th, 1863, the Woodstock Railway Company was organized. 4 years later, in 1867, Peter Thatcher Washburn, who had been Vermont's adjutant general during the Civil War, became the president of the Woodstock Railway Company. That same year, Hosea Doughton, a well-known teacher, mapmaker, and surveyor, was hired to be the engineer for the project. Hosea Doughton considered 4 main routes, but ultimately decided to go with the one shown here. It was the shortest and most direct. It was also the one that had 2 major engineering challenges for the railway's builders, Queechy Gorge and Shalley's Hill. And if you look at the map, you'll see Shalley's Hill is shown here, and directly beneath it is a diagram that shows the elevation of various landforms, including Shalley's Hill with an elevation of 779.5 feet, and Queechy Gorge, which had a depth of 163 feet. So this diagram really shows the disparity between the depth of Queechy Gorge and the elevation or height of Shalley's Hill. The decision to go with the Shalley's Hill route did face some opposition, as this cartoon suggests, which shows a prominent local citizen by the name of Thomas Powers objecting to the route. Washburn, the president of the railway, is shown as a train. If you look carefully, you can see Washburn's face is integrated into the train's smokestack. And here's another cartoon that expresses similar sentiments of Powers' opposition to the Shalley's Hill route. This time, Powers is depicted as a donkey. However, despite Powers' opposition, the Shalley's Hill route was approved. So let's take a look at the area of Shalley's Hill and see why it was such a major impediment. The maximum allowable grade for the railroad was 2.5%, and Shalley's Hill exceeded this grade. Consequently, in order to keep the grade at or below 2.5%, a cut about a mile in length needed to be made through the earth and rocks. To accomplish this, the railway company needed a large group of laborers. Wages of $1.75 for a 12-hour day were offered, which were considered good wages for the times. And soon there was a group working on each side of Shalley's Hill, both digging toward the middle. Within a year, the railway company had 8 miles of the planned railway line, including part of Shalley's Hill, graded. The photograph that you see here shows a group of laborers who worked on the Shelley's Hill cut. You might recognize this section with the steep hills on each side because it's now part of US Route 4, located a short distance from the intersection with I-89. As mentioned before, Shelley's Hill was not the only obstacle. There was also the issue of Quechee Gorge. In preparation for building a bridge over the gorge, the planning sketch that you see here was done, which shows the trusses and internal structure, the outer protective siding, and the piers and abutment. And here is a view, looking from the top down, of men working on the temporary scaffolding that was built before the trusses for the bridge were assembled. Note the ladder going down the gorge on the right-hand side of the photograph. And also the men who are sitting on top of the scaffolding, perhaps eating their lunch, while others work below. The Quechee Gulf Bridge was a howe truss bridge that used both wooden timber diagonal beams and vertical tension rods of iron. It was supposed to be stronger than a bridge made of only wood. It took about 3 weeks to assemble and bolt together this bridge from prefabricated numbered parts. Total construction cost of the bridge in 1875 was about $28,000. The bridge was 280 feet long and 163 feet above the river, which made it the highest bridge in the state. Protective wood covering, which you can see in this image right here, was put over the trusses of the bridge to protect them. Also, Frank J. Barrett, who's a local railway scholar, has said that the top boards of the bridge were capped with tin so that any sparks coming from the locomotive wouldn't set the bridge on fire. And this is a photograph of the completed Quechee Gulf Bridge, where the sides are armored and protected. And you can also see there's an oncoming locomotive. In 1906, 2 arches were added to help strengthen the bridge as increasingly heavier loads were carried across it. Eventually, in 1911, a metal bridge, which is the basis for the current bridge, replaced the wooden one. And I've heard Frank J. Barrett explain how the wooden bridge was replaced. He indicated that the metal bridge was built over the old wooden structure, and when the metal bridge was complete, the wooden beams were cut away and allowed to drop into the river below. And this is what that completed metal bridge looked like. Eventually, when the railway was discontinued and the right-of-way was sold to the state of Vermont to relocate part of what is now Route 4, the top of the bridge, the deck portion, was covered with concrete to make the current highway bridge. From there, the railway workers continued to lay track, which you can see being done here, and which often required significant amounts of excavation work. When the tracks were completed, it was time to test the railway. The Winooski was a 23-ton locomotive, and it tested the Quechee Gulf Bridge on August 12, 1875. Approximately 2,500 people turned out to watch. The bridge supposedly sank no more than a 1/4 inch under the weight of the train. One can only imagine what it felt like to be the engineer of the locomotive traveling across that bridge for the first time. Which reminds me of a story of a man who is known as Fearless Philo. He was a worker who helped to build the Quechee Gulf Bridge, and he used to show his feats of so-called bravery by standing on his head on the train tracks during the noon hour to the delight of the onlookers. According to local lore, he later selected a tree by the gorge, and he cut off the tree's branches as well as the top of the tree so that there was a 4-inch base. He would then do headstands while kicking his feet in the air 190 feet above the ground. Apparently, the first time he tried this trick, there were some coins in his pocket, which ended up at the bottom of the gorge. The Woodstock Railway's main stops after leaving the White River Junction station included Dewey's Mills, Quechee, Tassville, and Woodstock. The Dewey's Mill stop was located right next to the Quechee Gulf Bridge. The mill complex that was associated with the Dewey's Mill stop was located in the hamlet of Quechee. The mill was established in 1836 and ultimately grew into a large operation that employed over 100 people and had about 64 buildings. Peter Washburn, the then president of the Woodstock Railway, died in February of 1870 while also serving as the governor of Vermont. The new president of the Woodstock Railway, after Washburn died, was Albert Dewey, who was president of Dewey's Mills. And Dewey is shown in this photograph, standing right here in front of the office. Dewey's Mill was really an extensive mill complex. It was a site that at one time had had the contract to make the uniforms for both the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees. It was also the site of the first shoddy mill in the United States. Shoddy was a type of cloth that was made from processed rags and leftover scraps and cuttings from tailors. And for those interested in word origins, we still use the word shoddy today. However, instead of referring to the cloth, it's now generally used to refer to something that is poorly made or of inferior quality. This term first came into common parlance in the latter part of the 19th century through the textile manufacturing industry because of the creation of shoddy, the cloth. Incidentally, the shoddy maker that was used in the Quechee mill was manufactured by Reuben Daniels, who had his machine shop in West Woodstock, near where the Woodstock Farmers Market now stands. The next stop on the Woodstock Railway, past the Dewey's Mill stop, if headed west, was the Quechee Station, which is shown here. And you can see by the detail map that this stop had a passenger depot, it had a cattle shed, and it had a section house. And here is a view of right outside that cattle shed. It shows cattle being loaded onto a cattle car. The next stop after the Quechee Station, if headed west, was Tassville. And this is a view from across the river looking southwest over to the hamlet of Tassville. And it was taken around 1915. And just to orient you, over here on the left-hand side of the photograph is the Tassville Covered Bridge, which was constructed back in 1836 and was 190 feet long. Here is the Woodstock Railway Station and the train tracks. Here's the powerhouse. And this large building, which is no longer in existence, was the Taft's Mill. And the Taft brothers manufactured tools and metal implements in this building. And here's a map that shows the layout of that Tassville depot. Some of these landmarks, such as the powerhouse, the dam, and the bridge, are still in existence today. As an interesting side note, students who were living in Tassville used to ride the train to high school. The train would take them from the Tassville depot to the depot that was located in Woodstock at the eastern end of the village. And from there, they would walk to the high school, which was located at that time on South Street, in the general area where the Woodstock Elementary School now stands. The next stop on the Woodstock Railway, if headed west, was the Woodstock Depot, which ultimately became the terminus of the railway. Originally, plans had included going through Woodstock to Bridgewater and then on to Rutland, but those plans were never realized. The trip from White River Junction to Woodstock took between 40 and 45 minutes, and the train's normal operating schedule was to make 2 round trips a day, 6 days a week. When passengers arrived in Woodstock, they would have seen a robust area that included a passenger house, freight house, engine house, turntable, section house, cattle shed, storehouses, and a standard oil building. This photograph shows the main passenger building, which was located on Pleasant Street. And if you look carefully, you can see Pleasant Street on the right-hand side of the photograph. The passenger building had these wide, very distinctive overhanging eaves, as well as a tower at the back. And if you look to the left side of the photograph, you'll see the railway tracks. Here's a photograph from a different vantage point that shows the railway passenger building in the background and the railway tracks in the midground of the photograph. And over here behind the railway tracks are two coaches. This one happens to belong to the Woodstock Inn. And if you look carefully, here's a close-up of that coach. This photograph was probably taken in the 1890s. Eventually, the Woodstock Inn's horse-drawn coach is replaced by an electric bus. The period from 1890 to 1915 was really the heyday of the Woodstock Railway. The railway was prospering as it transported outbound such things as wool, logs, livestock, and agricultural products, and transported inbound such things as coal, grain, flour, cement, fertilizer, sugar, and people. And I put a special emphasis on the word people because this really was a period where tourism took off and many people came to Woodstock to visit. And ultimately, this set the stage for Woodstock becoming a tourist destination. Many people who rode the railway or lived near it have fond remembrances of it. And I wanted to share one remembrance that was written by a Woodstock resident named Dave Farley. Dave Farley wrote, I also remember one Halloween night about 1930, 1932, when all the various gangs of looking for something to get into converged on the railroad station. There was a freight car in front of Gillingham's warehouse, a coal car at Gilchrist's coal chute, and one or two others around. We pushed and pulled and moved all these around and left one on the hand-moved turntable between the tracks, and one parked in front of the shed where the engine in Woodstock was parked for the night. Satisfied we had really mixed things up, we went our way for other mischief. The next morning at school, comparing notes on Halloween activities, we were greeted by the news from the depot area kids that the railroad was hardly bothered. Given such memories, it was a sad day for many when the Woodstock Railway ceased operations in 1933. There were a number of factors that contributed to the demise of the railway, but most were due to declining revenue. For instance, in 1927, there was a major flood, and this flood damaged the train's rail bed and caused 15 major washouts. It took several weeks to rebuild the damaged parts of the line and months to repair the connecting roads that allowed people to access the railway, thus impacting the railway's ability to function for a number of months. Other losses of revenue were caused by the Great Depression. Passenger travel declined from nearly 16,000 people in 1927 to 2,438 by 1931. The various mills, including Dewey's and Parker's Mill in Quechee, had also decreased production during the Depression, thereby reducing the use of the railway. Still another loss of income came when the local electric company tapped into Vermont's hydro system and they no longer shipped coal via the railway. In all these cases, the railway lost income, which put a financial strain on the railroad. In addition, in 1930, there was a brush fire that destroyed 3 out of 4 pieces of the railway's passenger equipment, including a baggage car, combination car number 4, and coach number 6. These pieces were going to be expensive to replace. Then there was the advent of the automobile. The automobile gave people far more freedom to choose where and when they traveled, and it soon became the favored mode of transportation. Lastly, there was the death of Richard Billings, who had been named the railway's president. He had written out notes for the struggling railway, and shortly after his death, many of these notes needed to be repaid. The final run of the Woodstock Railway took place Saturday, April 15th, 1933. That day, the H.H. Payne left Woodstock for its last official run. Of the 350 passengers who rode the train that day to White River Junction, 14 had been on the first train ride back in 1875, 58 years earlier. One of the most memorable parts of the day for many people happened while en route between Woodstock and White River Junction. As the train tried to climb Shalley's Hill, which was the steepest part of the trip, it found it could not scale the grade, and the train had to back down as far as the Dewey's Mill station. But even after trying again, it was unable to make the hill. Upon investigation, the reason for the issue was clear. The tracks had been greased. The engine had to separate and leave one of the passenger cars that it was pulling behind on the Quechee Gorge Bridge, as the others were drawn over the hill. The guests arrived late in White River Junction, where there was a reception for the passengers. The three pranksters who were involved with greasing the tracks were Dean George, Stanley Booth Spencer, and Primo Capron. They lathered the tracks at the steepest part of Shalley's Hill with axle grease the night before. John French, the railroad's president, was described as being so vexed by the stunt that for the first time ever, he was known to have used strong language. The three pranksters got the inspiration for greasing the tracks after reading a magazine account that told how locusts were so thick out west that they would make the tracks slippery and stop a train. The night before, the three had first tried to apply soft soap to the tracks, but after a heavy rain that night, the soap washed off. So the three went back to the Capron store, which was owned by Primo Capron's father, and got a 3-pound can of axle grease and went back to the tracks to grease them. From a hill on his father's farm, which is now Marshland Farm, Dean George, one of the three pranksters, was able to watch the whole thing the next morning using binoculars. Apparently, when he saw the trouble that began unfolding, he did become very concerned that someone might get injured. Luckily, that was not the case. The secret was kept for 60 years, and despite efforts to identify the pranksters, their identities only became public when Dean George finally shared the story in 1993, some 60 years after the event and after his two friends had passed away. Following that fateful day, during the summer of 1933, the H.H. Payne was used to take up the rails of the Woodstock Railway. Part of US Route 4 was then relocated over to where the train had formerly run. Here are two images of the Shalley's Hill Cut close to the intersection of I-89. It shows what the area looked like in the 1870s and what it looks like now, with Route 4 running over it. As for the railway's impact, because of the railway, Woodstock transitioned from an agrarian community with a strong manufacturing-based economy into one where tourism became an increasingly important part of the town's economic engine. The Woodstock Inn, built in 1892, was one of just several inns and hotels which were built to accommodate the many guests who came to visit from far-off cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, because the Woodstock Railway made travel to Woodstock convenient. The railway's legacy also lives on through the structures at the old depot. The main part of the depot, the old passenger building, still stands on the site. For a number of years, it was adapted to serve a variety of functions ranging from a diner to a parts store. However, in more recent years, it's been renovated so that it looks similar to how it looked when it was being used by the railway. Another site that still remains at the old depot is the turntable site. This photo shows what it looks like today, and you can see it if you go down to the old depot, as well as many other changes that are going on with both the East End Park and the Ottauquechee Trail. Thus ends the story of the Woodstock Railway. Again, it was a short 13.88-mile spur line, but it left an indelible mark on Woodstock's history. For those who are interested in learning more about this railway line, there are several books that have been published on this topic, including ones by Frank J. Barrett and Edgar Mead. There's also a terrific article on the Woodstock Railway by Robert C. Jones entitled Historical Modeling, the Woodstock Railway. The Woodstock History Center, located in Woodstock, Vermont, has some of these resources, as well as an extensive collection of photographs and ephemera related to the Woodstock Railway.